you about a new organization called the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. We stand firmly against the war on science that is predicated on the appeal to nature fallacy, which is the belief that whatever is natural must be good and whatever is unnatural must be bad. This belief has become an impediment to advances in areas such as human health, social progress, and even environmental progress. In the field of medicine, the appeal to nature fallacy has already led to catastrophic outcomes. Resistance to vaccines threatens public health and the lives of children. The unwarranted resistance to GMOs has not only held back the fight against climate change, but it has also hampered our ability to feed the developing world as well. Campaigns against GMOs have also held back efforts to ward off the deadly Aedes aegypti mosquito, which has killed countless millions as a carrier of disease and plagues. The scientific consensus concerning the safety of GMOs is solidly supported in every major scientific organization across the planet. The only thing green about being anti-GMO is the extra cash that is made by overcharging for expensive boutique food. But that won't cut it when it comes to raising crops with accelerating heat stress, droughts, floods, disease, and insect infestations brought on by a hotter planet. It makes no sense to accept the call of the IPCC for decarbonization within the next 12 years and yet reject their conclusion that these goals are impossible without nuclear power, which has proven itself to be the cleanest, safest, and most reliable way of achieving decarbonization. It is the most reliable way to decarbonize simply because the alternatives of weather-dependent power sources are inherently unreliable. And nuclear is the cleanest energy source because it is the only form of energy production that completely encases its waste stream. Super safe, advanced Generation 4 reactors, which will almost completely convert existing nuclear waste to centuries worth of energy, are coming very close to commercialization. In fact, it goes completely against most everything we're led to believe, but nuclear is legitimately the safest form of energy generation according to all the accepted worldwide energy fatality data. But there is one thing that nuclear is not safe for, and that is the fossil fuel industry. The fact of the matter is that the fossil fuel industry has a long history of funding the anti-nuclear movement, along with climate change deniers, to protect their bottom line. Solid science is in dire need of a champion. And that is what eco-modernism is all about. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor do we accept funding from corporations or industry. Nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves. To the contrary, we believe that humanity is at a crossroads that severely threatens our future on this planet. We reject the idea of resource limits on many levels. The advance of science has a long history of getting around problems of resource scarcity and will continue to do so. Another reason is that Earth is just one of a multitude of worlds available to explore in our solar system and beyond. Comets and asteroids are untapped reservoirs for raw materials. If we could find a way to thrive in artificial ecosystems off-world, we could use what we learn to help sustain terrestrial ecosystems here on Earth. I hope by now you understand the worthiness of our cause. Ecomodernism is really only a philosophy at this time. I want to talk to you about the necessity of turning it into a movement, which will be part of the larger environmentalist movement. For it is only through our presence and participation that there can be any hope of moving environmentalism in the right direction. Our aim is not to divide the environmental movement, but rather to multiply its numbers with the incorporation of many scientific and educational communities that is working to both build chapters of eco-modernist societies and support our growth worldwide. We aspire to increase our numbers by bringing together the numerous supporters of climate action that have been alienated by mainstream environmentalism's wildly contradictory support for the shutting down of nuclear power plants in the midst of a climate emergency, and welcome them into our ranks. Thank you.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, EcoModder channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, EcoModder Society of North America.
Let me tell you something about this world I see. Let me tell you something, brother, about you and me. There's no such a thing called freedom, just a word they say. Freedom is in heaven, that's where it stays. Just a word they say. Freedom, just a word they say. Let me tell you something about this world I see. With my own two eyes, 20/20 vision. Let me tell you something, brother, about you and me. Just a word they say. Freedom lives in heaven, that's where it stays. Freedom, just a word they say. Freedom, just a word they say. Just a word they say. Freedom is in heaven, that's where it stays.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Carl Pauls. This is the Eco-Modernist Channel Live. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti, Chris Bergen, and our special guest. Isaac Arthur has a degree in physics from Kent State University. He is the creator of the wildly successful Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, an award-winning weekly science education and entertainment show with about 800,000 subscribers and over 600 episodes on YouTube. Isaac is also a regular guest on a variety of news and entertainment shows ranging from online productions to national radio shows, and he consults on science fiction books and video games. He has received the National Space Society's Pioneer Award, and in 2023, he was elected the National Space Society's president. Welcome to the program, Isaac.
Thanks for having me on, Cole.
Great. So sorry, I'm double checking everyone's audio because of a technical issue. One more time, say hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
Zoom is coming in. Yes. Thank you everyone for your patience for watching. We just had a great week. I went to the Thorium Energy Alliance conference and we had a terrific program there. A lot of hopefully near future technologies coming down the pipe. And that's one of the things that I really started to enjoy about your program, Isaac, was, not just the far science fiction, but sort of the technologies on the horizon that are just out of reach. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about the National Space Society?
Well, the National Space Society was formed in the mid-'80s from a mixture of Wernher von Braun's National Space Institute and then the L5 Society that had been founded by O'Neill and Henson a few years before that in the 70s. And they just kind of merged together from mutual shared interest. Since then, we've put a focus on space development. That's been the core idea of what the National Space Society focuses on, is not just how do we explore space, not just doing astronomy, not just going to the moon one more time, but how do we actually make communities in space? How do we develop space, set up an actual thriving economy in space, actually build communities in space, and use space to potentially defend Earth from man-made problems as well as things like asteroids, or even hypothetically an alien invasion, although we're not really doing white papers on that yet. And it's home to everyone who loves space science or science fiction, and it is a great place to basically kind of get yourself into the industry as well as to get yourself into space. It's just focused on holding conferences and events to try to advocate for space, learn more about space, and in about a month here, we'll be having our annual International Space Development Conference. This year it's in LA at the Sheraton by the LAX airport. And we'll be giving out a number of awards, and including one to William Shatner, who was getting a Lifetime Achievement, the Robert Heinlein Award. And previous award winners include Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Buzz Aldrin, and a host of other folks involved in space. So yeah, hope you'll come by if you're in the LA area, check out the conference and meet some other people who love space.
That's great. So I see that May 23rd will be is that right? Yeah.
That probably is right. It's always the last weekend before Memorial Day. It's
Wonderful.
No special reason. It's just always cheaper to do hotel conferences on Memorial Day.
Wonderful. I'll put that link in our chat so that everyone online can check it out. Yeah, it's of course not been your first time on Gabe's program, the Eco-Modernist podcast. Back in the day, you did some terrific collaborations. Gabe, why don't you and Isaac reflect on some of the topics you covered back then? Oh, Gabe, you're muted.
Yeah, I just don't like to, in case things drop or anything.
Go ahead.
But anyhow, yeah, we had the late Dr. James Powell, who was involved with the atomic rocketry, building atomic rocketry and doing that kind of research. And we talked a lot about his concept of Star Tram. And we also had, which is, by the way, basically a vacuum tube, or close as you could get to a vacuum, with using maglev technology to launch into space. And then we had Dr. Franklin Chang Diaz, who is in the Astronaut Hall of Fame. And he's got a company called Ad Astra, and he was talking about his technology, which is how would you describe that, Arthur? I mean,
Casimir, the variable. Oh, I'm going to forget what some of the words are for. They are variable specific impulse magnetic rocket. And actually, I just did a short video on that on YouTube a few days ago, so you think I'd remember the acronym a little bit better. But it's a type of sophisticated ion drive that they're looking to potentially use to get to Mars with. And he's been working on that for many years. It's one of the more promising ion drive systems for actually getting good thrust. One of the problems we always have with ion drives is you need a whole lot of power to run one. So they might be better for manned or large space expeditions to other planets, but they're not really the thing you want for fast acceleration in the local area. So they haven't got as much build-up as possible yet, though are very promising for the future. And of course, he's a great talker too. I remember that was a good conversation we had then.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We talked about maglev, and I there's a lot of debate about, is that even really just science fiction completely?
No,
And
we actually have maglev trains over there, but
well, not maglev. I meant Star Tram. I meant Star Tram.
right. Star Tram's a little bit
Yeah.
trickier because it's kind of like saying how big can you build a tower. That usually falls into the class of what on the show we call mass drivers, because there's a lot of systems like that, which you can include space catapults, can include the Lofstrom loop and other launch loops, or even the orbital ring, or the tethered ring concept that Phil Swan has been working on recently, another fellow from the National Space Society. And the basic idea there is that if you can accelerate something through a vacuum tube, an evacuated tube up to the top of the atmosphere, you can release it there at a very high speed already without having had to use any rocket fuel. So it could be a nuclear-powered system, for instance. And that means you aren't using rocket fuel by the ton. And that means it gets up to space with all of its fuel. If you gave it any intact, you can start doing stuff up there. It's also vastly cheaper. But if people say, well, if it's so much better, if we need these launch tubes, why aren't you using it right now? And it's essentially the same reason why you don't build a freeway system along the Oregon Trail when you got the wagons going out there in the first place. You build these things in stages. It's much cheaper per launch, but you need to be doing hundreds of launches, a day or a week to pay for something like that. In the same way that you just don't build a freeway between two cities if you only have one person going there once a week. And that's basically the concept there. So it is that promising thing that lets you move from the current era to when you could actually be putting people into space for pennies on the dollar. And that is why folks say, well, could you ever really go to space yourself? We say, well, yes, you could. We have to get to that point first, but it is the same as saying to someone in say, Manhattan in the 1700s, could you personally ever get yourself off to California? And the answer is, well, yes, you could, but it's a lot easier now. You got to build that infrastructure first. And, you can do a transatlantic voyage now. These things get cheaper with time, and the technology exists to do them. Even now, they need prototyping, but the physics and basic engineering is very solid. You won't really know how well it works until the day you actually build one, though.
Yeah.
I want to butt in here because that's a great segue into something we talk about, which is energy developed in the global south. It's our view of technology and our view of infrastructure development that informs, how do we help the global south avoid like the mistakes of fossil fuels and industrialization that we went through. And so what is it that we might see in the future, looking back on Earth, looking back on the present age, and what are the mistakes in infrastructure development that we could try to avoid? It's fascinating.
That is a trickier concept in many ways, because we can say all we want that it's much easier to do X from the beginning, but a lot of times you really do need that infrastructure in place. An example that often comes up when people steal military technology from the U.S. is now they have what we worked so hard on and say, well, that's great. They have what we finished prototyping 10 years ago, and it'll take them 10 years to actually build up the expertise pool and infrastructure to build it themselves. So it's not ideal, but it's not as bad as it sounds like. And that same unfortunately applies in the reverse to trying to develop places like Africa or South America, where they just, there's the intent there. There's obviously a number of unstable factors that make it harder there, politically. But at the same time, no one's sitting around saying, no, we don't want to develop. You know, they know what the methodology is. It's hard to replicate a lot of times, though. And in a lot of cases, they could skip the entire fossil fuel process, but for them, it might look different. It might be that, you know, for a lot of local traffic, you're using a lot more bikes and buses, and for more distance, you don't do many freeways, you do a lot more electric rail. And that means you have to use, you can't use the quite same lessons learned from the United States. You can't just open a book and say, well, how did, you know, this company do it 40 years ago? Because we're at that stage now, because you're not. You are walking on a whole new path, which is kind of free and exciting, but also harder at the same time. And for instance, we might see a lot of places in near desert regions decide they want to do seawater greenhouses and, you know, evaporation, irrigation nearby them, whereas you just don't going to do that where I'm at up here by the Great Lakes. There's obviously great places for solar power, but are you going to go for solar, you know, photoelectric, or are you going to go for geothermal, which of course, if there's no birds nearby, is much easier to do. Whereas here in Ohio, we can do solar too, but we work better with a solar that would be solar plus nuclear, because that's cloudy here, we get weather, and it just decreases the load a lot. It's also easier to do, just slowly phasing out those coal or oil-fired plants to use that in conjunction. Of course, I do live in an area that's right by a nuclear power plant, so it's always been much cheaper electricity than our neighbors get, and yet they still, for some reason, don't want to get a newer, better, and a potentially cheaper reactor built in their area. So
Yeah, it's unfortunate to see that America stalled. While we are, you know, we internationally we are lending a hand to those folks in developing nations. We had a fantastic guest. For any of Isaac Arthur's fans who have wandered onto this podcast, we want to introduce you to the African Nuclear Congress and Princey Montambeni, who's the president of the African Nuclear Congress. She's doing some wonderful work, sort of with the IAEA, with the international nuclear community, to build up the infrastructure and the know-how of her communities in order to make nuclear energy and, you know, a reduced fossil fuel usage in Africa a reality.
Yeah. You know, speaking of South America, the tallest mountain from the center of the earth is Mount Chimborazo,
Yeah.
and I believe that's in Ecuador. I mean, I would
favorite
love
location for building Star Tram on.
exactly. You know,
And as I understand it, they actually have talked to the government there about that. Some organizations have it, and they are open to doing it, which is understandable. Being the first cheap spaceport into space is definitely a way to put yourself on the map. At the same time, mountains are handy for that, but they're not really tall enough either, so you still have to keep going a little bit more above that.
Yeah.
And we're not really sure how high you need to go for that to be safe enough to release a ship without too much drag yet, but probably up to at least 20 kilometers, I would think. And we often talk about doing to 50 or 80 too. There's a lot of options for how to build these things, and of course another problem is the bigger and taller you want to make it, the exponentially more expensive it would probably tend to be to do. So, whereas a mountain's just right there already. So,
yeah.
and the equator gives you such a nice free boost. So,
Go ahead.
ideally, though, I'd
Oh,
say,
No, sorry. Keep going, Isaac, and then we'll get to Chris.
I always am interested in building equatorial space elevators or space rings or launchers, but ideally, we want to focus on actually being able to take people directly from their own town or village directly up into space, which is where your tether-based systems like the tethered ring or orbital ring tend to come a little bit more handy, because there you're building a space elevator that's only, say, 50 kilometers long, or maybe 100, not 40,000 kilometers long, like the typical equatorial one would be. So you can use materials that actually exist in nature and can be mass produced already for those. And then you don't have to deal with that big rocket loud problem there. You just get on a tram car that accelerates probably subsonically up to above the atmosphere and then speeds up after that. And you could have one of those potentially in every single town. And it would be probably a bit of a flight risk. You did quite that many of them, but so are cell phone towers. You put lights on them, and if it fell out of the sky, people say, "What would happen if that thing fell down?" Well, not a lot. Air drag would slow it to about 100 miles an hour, and it's a while. So if it's going to land on the ground, and it'd be best not to stand underneath it when it did, though you'd probably survive if it did land on you. So we try to aim for technology that makes space travel practical for everyone. And one of the awesome things about those kind of launch systems is they don't just get you into space. They can actually get you around the planet in like an hour. You go up the tether, you go to orbital speeds around the planet for, again, maybe the price of an airplane ticket or even less, and just a local airplane ticket. And you're anywhere on the planet an hour later and head on down to whatever the nearest terminal is and get on the local transport. And that is where we say space can be of benefit to humanity, because we say, well, we all love the idea of settling planets one day and boldly going where no one has gone before, but can we actually make that economically useful to Earth? And of course, a system like that, you build it because it has space launch capability, but its main economic benefit, and thus its main usage, isn't to get to the moon, it's to get from New York to Hong Kong in an hour and a half, and for $10. At that point in time, it's high, you can move millions of people that way without noise issues, without dangerous issues, because even when the cargo pods came off in higher altitude, it re-enters, slows down, pops a parachute, people come down safely.
Wonderful. Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, there's when people develop new ideas and implement them, there's this, I think it was called value of desolation or something, where you have a great idea, you can build a first of a kind, it works, but to get it into common usage to where it becomes whether profitable or at least used fairly often, where not many people can get through that all the time. So have you identified your valley of desolation or whatever you want to call it, and got ideas on how to overcome that or ride through it?
I'd say a lot of folks have tried to, but a lot of times you only see that in the rear view mirror. It's you can say this or that's getting in the way, and we usually phrase it like a Kickstarter getting into space. What thing is the big economic push that gets you moving $1 trillion into space a year as a sector, as opposed to NASA research and the military sector alone or the communications sector are pretty big economic sectors, but the energy industry, if you do say space-based solar power, that's a multi-trillion-dollar annual economic sector that other things can piggyback on. The question there is, say, well, could you do that? When we say, well, we actually have gotten there with the current level of technology, we could do these things, and they would have been wildly successful compared to what the cost of energy might have been, say, 20, 30 years ago. The thing is that in that same time, other technologies have improved too. Car engines have actually gotten more efficient. Nuclear power has actually gotten more well designed. The same problem that nuclear often has is that it's been getting better, but so has everything else. And that's a parallel concept there to the Valley of Desolation, is that it's not that you are competing in a vacuum. You have some benchmark that you say, if I can get here in 10 years, this would be profitable. And it would have been if everybody else hadn't also gotten advanced in that same period of time too. And that is often the case with space, is that there's too many moving targets to really say, this is the thing that if we got it to move out of the way would suddenly change it all. I would think that folks would suggest asteroid mining is another common one, and that's not a bad one for precious metals. We really want to mine those asteroids, though, for the purpose of building things in space cheaper or getting fuel cheaper. But you can bring gold or platinum down from them and say, much cheaper than it is now. If you found a big stack of gold bars on the moon, it would actually be economical with modern technology to go pick them up and bring them home. You would make a big profit on that. And yet at the same time, is it really easier to mine a rock for gold 100 million miles away when there's untold millions of tons of the stuff in the Earth's crust that we have to find first? And that is another example of, yes, we've developed this much superior technology, but all of a sudden your whole asteroid mining industry collapses when someone comes up with an easier way to tap the mantle of the planet, for instance, and sift material out of that. And I wouldn't expect that specific scenario to happen, but it is a lot of cases like that have happened in developing space industry over the years. So that even though they've been making progress nonstop, a lot of times the goalposts have had to move because civilization keeps moving. And for us individually, that's great. That is why you can buy I was watching Wheel of Fortune reruns from the 80s last night. You can buy a TV now that's bigger than ones then for less money, even though money was 7 times more valuable at that point. So you see, wow, there's that Tandy computer for $1,200. As I could get that now for, a modern new one for the same price or less, even though money, of course, has inflated since then. There's a lot of that. and
Yeah.
their standard of living has risen in so many levels. We have become so much more productive in so many more ways. And yet at the same time, that can be a hurdle for emerging technologies because they do, again, have to keep catching up that moving goalpost.
So this brings us around to what's the best case for bootstrapping that industrial development in space. I was really glad to see that you covered solar in orbit recently again, but you didn't really talk about what is the bootstrapping case and how do we go from zero to producing energy to scaling up industry.
I think one of the reasons I tend to avoid that is because it's kind of subject to debate. There is no ironclad, until you actually have launched a prototype at least, trying to talk about the economics of how well a solar power satellite's going to do until you actually have one up there that's doing it, even if it's just a 10th scale one, to me becomes, and it's a nice theoretical exercise, and I believe it's certainly possible and economically viable, but you can't quote people with numbers. When you need to know how many cents per kilowatt hour this is going to cost you, and you can say, well, somewhere between 10 and 30. Okay. If it's 12, we can make this work. Is it? We don't know. And at what point do you say, can I source this stuff off the moon instead? If I put a moon base up there, can I get some of the mass for these things there? Can I come up with a better way of maintaining a solar power satellite up there with a little bit more experience? Or if we have a base up there that lets us do EVA to go repair or fix them, or someone makes a drone that can do that can be controlled from the ground. There are so many tiny little advances that can make these things a lot more plausible. And at the same time, could we do it now? Yes, we absolutely could. A lot like Starlink. You can make Starlink work from space. You're not usually going to use that in a city too often, though, because you're going to have much better connection to fiber. So it is a case of where is that going to be profitable? It might be marginal right now, or it might be able to compete the system very easily once it got rolling. You won't know that, though, until you actually put it up there. And we haven't got a prototype yet, so I can only speculate. Same for asteroid mining. We have not actually really done much sampling of asteroids. We have done at least a little bit in the last decade with the DUST mission, for instance. DART mission. But until we've actually gone back to the moon and started scooping up and trying to refine dirt using some of the processes we've been using in laboratories. Blue Origins has done a lot of work on that of late too. We don't really know how much it's going to cost to make a solar panel or the basic wafer on the moon and put it back, because it's just hard to say. It's like going to a contractor and saying, hey, how much it costs to build a patio in my backyard? He said, well, somewhere between X and Y, probably. And it probably will be in there, but that's a big difference on whether or not you want to do it or not. And so we're just not in a position to say that yet. I know it's always disappointing for folks too, and of course some folks will cheerfully give off numbers, which they might sincerely mean too. I've seen some very detailed studies on these things, but for my part, I tend to not try to get too specific when I just don't think that specific of a target's going to hold.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Gabe.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mentioned this in another program, and see what Isaac thinks about that. But I look at the solar panels in space being more useful as a way of protecting the poles from just flooding the planet as a result of the being melted. And so
yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Solar shades are a great way to do it. The same basic technology. You go up to the moon and you get some aluminum foil. Or you could do it from Earth too, but we assume aluminum foil is a relatively easy thing to make on the moon. There's a big energy supply there of sun, and it's a scalable industry up there. But whether you're taking it from space or not, one little piece of aluminum foil like you'd buy at the store can reflect sunlight away from the planet. Whether you put that in orbit or you put that out at a Lagrange point between us and the sun. And it doesn't need to have a really good lifetime, but it probably lasts fine. It's a simple device. It's a sheet of metal. It's nice if it reflects light, but even if it absorbs it and emits it omnidirectionally, it still cuts down a lot of what hits. It's nice to get it for power, but you don't have to. You can just set up a bunch of shots of aluminum foil. And it said my standing default way of handling global warming, if it got too bad, would be to find a near-Earth asteroid, shove it at L1, and then nuke it to a blew up there, just to cause a dust pattern for a decade or so until it managed to fix it with something more permanent. But you have options like that, and they do work. I've seen folks debate whether or not they would work, and they absolutely, of course, would work. Whether or not they're economically viable, well, that's always that question. I don't know how much it costs to produce a sheet of aluminum foil on the moon and move it through space, but you can do things even thinner than aluminum foil because in space there's no wind, there's no gravity. Things just tend to stay where you leave them. You can do very thin objects. And so you basically would put sheets of that up to block some of the sunlight. And say, well, I don't want to obscure the sun. It's like, well, that's fine because you're not going to obscure the sun. None of us ever look at the sun anyway. I had the eclipse in my backyard a couple weeks ago. It was beautiful to see. But you can't look at the sun other than that moment in totality. You're looking at the kind of vague space it is in the sky, which is why we think of it as very big. And so you're not going to notice if people put a whole bunch of tiny little things in front of it, especially when those tiny little things are too small for you to see individually even a mile away, let alone 1 million miles away at the Lagrange point. So you just see a
Yeah.
slight decrease in the amount of light that comes through.
By the way, the Lagrange point, for some people who might not know, that's like the halfway distance between the sun and the Earth.
Metaphorically, it's a lot closer to the Earth than it is the sun, but it is and sometimes people mistakenly think it's the place where the gravity between them neutralizes out too, but that's not quite right. The Lagrange point between us and the sun, which is about 4 times farther than the moon is from us, is that place that's just close enough to Earth that anything that would be between us and the sun would be pulled just a little bit towards Earth all the time, and it acts a little bit of a brake on it. The closer you are to the sun, the faster you orbit the sun. So by having something that's pulling you, slowing you down, right, you'll stay right with Earth at that point. So at the L1 point is where something which should be moving faster around the sun will actually slow down to orbit with Earth. The L2 point, which is behind Earth and kind of the same distance, is the place where something is being pulled on by Earth and the sun in conjunction to make it just a little bit faster so it stays the Earth. The L4 and L5 spot are off to the sides, like a 60-degree angle. You can draw an equilateral triangle with them and the Earth and the sun. And those are all with them and the moon and the Earth, for instance, any two bodies. And the L5 place is where we always thought about putting a big old O'Neill cylinder or space habitat one day, which is how it got to be called the L5 Society back in the day. There's no special reason why it couldn't have been L4. They just went L4, L5 instead. But that would have been with the lunar L5 point, though. Those are very valuable places. The James Webb Telescope is at L2 point. It helps to block out the sunlight that would otherwise get and make it harder to see with, although it orbits that spot. But spots like that are incredibly valuable, and it would be an amazing place, or L1, to put power collectors and solar shades to control temperature, as well as to deal with things like electromagnetic storms. People worry about us getting some solar flare that would knock out our infrastructure, and it is so much easier to deflect particles 1 million miles out than to do it right above your atmosphere. So we talk about, well, could we give Mars an atmosphere one day? And they say, well, let's nuke Mars's core. I don't know how exactly that would work, but it's much easier just to build an electromagnet. And as it turns out, that an electromagnet we build and run on solar power is actually a much better magnet than 1 trillion tons of spinning metal is. So we could just put a little magnetic deflector out at the L1 point of any planet like Mars, and it would serve as even better than Earth's magnetosphere. And at relatively low power too, like the replenishment rate similar to what a regular modern nuclear reactor would produce. So,
By the way, that solar storm you're referring to is like, it was once. It could be very drastic. It could, yeah. I mean, just for our people who was watching this, I mean, it could like just well explain that the Kensington effect and all of that a little bit.
The sun is always emitting very high speed particles. The solar wind is basically hydrogen that boils off the surface. And in fact, we have to consider tapping that in the long term via a process called star lifting to mine the place out. It's got more stuff in it than the whole rest of the solar system combined many times over again. But the sun is kind of a bubbling pot, and every so often you get these eruptions on it that blow out a big chunk. And these can be as big as a coronal mass ejection. And it's a bad thing if that hits Earth. But the Earth is only about 1/1000th of the sun's actual cross section this distance. So statistically, we're unlikely to get hit by one of them. It can still happen, though. We get hit by part of one or the edge of one. And that can be horribly damaging. This is a huge wave of high-speed ionized particles, and that can have stripping effects on the atmosphere. The very pretty auroras are one of those, but they're very damaging to your space infrastructure and to your communications grid and radio systems. And if you want to avoid that, it's a good place to be putting up a magnet at L1 that would block all that and deflect it around you. For that same reason, this is one of those most valuable places to do industrial development, because it helps to protect the planet, it helps protect the ozone layer, it helps protect everything at that point in time. And eventually you can cut down the radiation that's in like the Van Allen radiation belt by just deflecting particles away. So for all that Earth has a wonderful, wonderful magnetosphere, you can always be made even better with some help. And that makes it much more viable to leave people in space for years at a time without having to, cover their ships in a meter of lead or something like that. And so if you are doing these systems where, over at L1 you've got magnetic deflector, power collectors beaming energy home, and solar shades, or mirrors for that matter, to enhance the sunlight, you can much more easily control a planet's temperature, which obviously might be something we want to be really careful about with our own planet, because unless you actually know how to predict the weather accurately, maybe not the best thing in the world to be tampering with the solar influx coming into it, but it does give us the option to make places like Mars very temperate and relatively cheap. You start talking about, I want to build a solar panel the size of a planet or the size of a continent. That sounds kind of crazy until you remember there's actually about 1 million of them with that combined space, and then say they are really only as thick as paper. And at that point, you say, well, we could never produce that much. Well, if you actually look at how much aluminum foil we produce a year, so it's on that, with the whole aluminum industry, if you take all the aluminum we produce a year and would do it as, say, aluminum foil instead of chunks, it would actually cover the planet. So it is inside our current industrial capacity to do this, and it's not like aluminum is the majority of our economy, let alone aluminum foil. We could do this now. And so these are options that become infinitely easier when you start developing a lot of these better launch systems. Even just reusable rockets, like we see with SpaceX, have changed that game. And it's hard when you see how fast computers or digital technology have done, and then you look at how long it's been since we put somebody on the moon, to say, oh yeah, this could happen any minute now. But after 50 years, we are finally starting to see that snowball begin. And I think for a lot of us, we'll get to see a period where all these cool ideas we plan to have in space actually are viable and begin happening.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris, and then I might riff on this exponential development idea.
Okay. I'm also going to mention the solar shielding. I had mentioned that in the question to James Hansen, who I've been fortunate to attend 2 of his public lectures over the years. He immediately came back with that does nothing for ocean acidification, which may be the larger long-term problem. And I'm wondering, do you know if there are alkaline minerals or products in space where we could maybe sprinkle dust back onto the Earth, which would help mitigate some of the acidification, and which would also help out with the solar as well?
Yep. I would say, and I'm not going to knock him with something when he said that's a wrong kind of way to be looking at it. This is a tool that addresses part of the problem. Find another tool that does the other parts. And as an example, if you've got energy abundance from cheap solar panel or power or nuclear, you can suddenly start taking carbon dioxide out of the air, along with the water out of the air, and recombining them into the hydrocarbon you made them from. Methane is the easiest to do this with, the Sabatier process, but you can do gasoline if you want to. And gasoline,
Right,
if it's carbon neutral, is an amazing portable power source compared to a modern battery. And you will spend more energy to make it than you get out of it, but who cares if you got energy abundance? You just use that for your portable power sources. Much as all cell phones, they take way more energy to charge than we actually get out of them when we use them. Same as any battery does. So if you're spending 2 or 3 times as much energy to make this portable fuel source, okay. Once you have a carbon neutral economy, or one that has energy abundance that isn't based on that, then you can suck all that carbon dioxide out of the air or out of the water and turn it back into something you would actually like to use, or into a gigantic pile of graphite that you dump in a hole somewhere if you just feel there's too much around. That energy abundance comes from the exact same sort of technologies that make spaceflight cheap, or that let you build a solar shade around a planet. and they also need a lot of the same industry infrastructure in place to build them, a lot of the same technology and engineers. So you address the problems as you have solutions to them, and you don't pass one in the meantime. But as an example, I know a lot of folks would object to doing geoengineering projects that might involve putting dust particles in the air or putting something that's going to absorb the carbon dioxide from the ocean. But you can still do them. How effective it is, that's not particularly my wheelhouse. I'm not a chemist, but yes, space has these things. Almost anything you can find on Earth's surface, you can find on the moon, because we assume the one was made from the other. And thus you go dig it up, you find it, and then you just fire it back towards Earth out of a big cannon. But don't call it a cannon, because that might upset people if there was a big Earth cannon pointed at us. But and the thing just blows up as it approaches the atmosphere and spreads out as it goes. And is that economically viable? But probably, if you put the infrastructure to put it in place. Might it be easier to get that from sources locally on the planet and drop it from air balloons or planes? That I couldn't answer. I mean, it would just depend on the circumstances. But we have large amounts of these resources available, when we are never going to find a one-size-fits-all solution to all of our problems. And the perfect can be the enemy of the good, I would say, for that case too.
Great. And let me give another call out to one of our old programs. We had the Sin Fuel Forum with Dr. Prakash discussing, well, his number one target was methanol as an intermediary product, especially because many diesel engines can be converted to methanol.
Yes.
Go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, well, right now the progress that they've made so far on fusion, which might be just as far as it could get, is a matter of seconds or less. But what I wonder all the time is, might that be enough to just use a fusion reactor just for the purpose, which maybe is all it can do, to provide such a tremendous amount of electricity in one shot that you could lift a heavy launch vehicle into space with it? You could launch one.
Possibly. One of the biggest problems we have with fusion, besides not having one, is that there's a bit of a misstep in people's thinking on this. Say, well, fusion's hard because you're trying to replicate the inside of a star, like the sun. Say, oh no, that would be the easy part. Our sun takes billions of years per fusion event that's going on. A typical piece of hydrogen needs 10 billion years or more before it have a 50-50 chance of undergoing fusion. If you took a big chunk of star matter and only remove the energy of fusion from it, like a ton of it, you could almost run a weak light bulb, because that's how slow the fusion's coming out of it. The power ratio there is like 10 to the 30 divided by 10 to the 26. It's like not even a milliwatt a kilogram.
Wow.
It's really small. And yet there's obviously very bright stars there because it has a lot of mass. You need to replicate the conditions not even inside something like a supergiant, but something more like a supernova to actually have a use for a reactor. And this is always going to be easier the bigger you make it. But that's okay. If you got a fusion plant that is big enough to run, economically can only be built, so you have to build a whole terawatt reactor that will run the eastern seaboard, that's fine. You can make that work. But that's a lot harder to turn into a flight system for a rocket ship. And actually releasing that as you go is a lot harder. Your ideal way to use something like core matter would be have a wormhole that dumped from your spaceship's rocket nozzle to the center of the sun and just blew hot matter out the back of it. But a lot of times it's going to be very hard to make a system more efficient than chemical rockets for getting off of planets. That's why we like those other launch systems. Your more efficient rocket engines are exactly that. They're slow. They're like ion drives. They get you to a higher speed with the same amount of propellant, but they're going to want several months to pull it off. And that is one of those things where, yes, a fusion reactor, if we can make it work, would be awesome. One that can be made to work inside something as small as a car or a train or a rocket engine would be even more awesome. I long for that day. It makes all of our problems go away at so many levels, although it introduces some new ones because that's how the hydro works on these things. But I would take any fusion reactor that can actually achieve economic electricity production, even at a continent-wide scale. The flip side of that, though, is we have to remember we already have a gigantic fusion reactor pumping out energy, and while solar has its limitations, it has gotten so much better than when I was a kid, and it really was a pipe dream technology at the time. It took 20, 40 years to make happen. But it's starting to get that point of being really economical and not just something that's going to run your calculator. You know, so we are getting much better with that, and this is that situation where you might have problems making a fusion reactor efficient just because we're making all the other power generation stuff so much more efficient. That doesn't mean you've eliminated the need for these things, or that we shouldn't be pursuing that like crazy, because it is the golden grail of what you want to be, with a possible exception of micro black holes for power generation, or maybe vacuum energy if you make that work, which you probably cannot. And yet we don't necessarily have to get that perfect solution yet. We go for whatever we can make work. And if you've got something that works, you just keep throwing effort at the other things so they work too. And eventually you find whatever's best. In the meantime, you take what you can use.
Right. Yeah. My
But you know,
oh, sorry. I was going to say, my friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Morrison, likes to say, well, fusion, that's the third gear. That's the international space travel mode of energy production. Second gear, that's fission. That'll help us pass the orbit of Mars. And solar is definitely, you know, the energy production for near Earth. But chemical, that's the first gear. You need chemical or an alternative, like EV for space launch, of these alternative launch modes to get off of a planetary body. Sorry, Gabe, I cut you off.
yeah, I'm sorry. I think I cut you guys off, but maybe, and maybe you could tell me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's just a 24/7 powered, power producing fusion reactor might be just impossible to build.
It might be, or it might be impossible to build at scale. I mean, you can build one smaller than a star. You could take a gas giant or 100 of them and suck out all their deuterium and drop them into something much tighter, and that will produce fusion power for you at a better rate than our sun would for the same mass. So you can go smaller than our sun. When there are stars that are a tenth our mass that do regular fusion, and they'll be running for 1 trillion years because that's how slow they produce power. That's kind of neat in a way, but also very frustrating if you're trying to use your fuel supply up in a way that's effective for you for a spaceship when you'd like to burn it all up in a year. We may never actually make one that is reasonably economic for our purposes, but that can vary. If I've got a place out past Pluto where it's kind of hard to use solar there, you still can all the way out to a place like Pluto if you don't mind building giant parabolic dishes of aluminum foil that concentrate it down on a collector. And again, no wind, no rain, not that big an issue to build a big or thin sheet of aluminum or whatever metal you use. But at a certain point, if you want to have power, you're either going to be using fission, which is a much more limited supply, or you're limiting fusion, which is a limited but much larger supply. And there is so much hydrogen and deuterium out in deep space. So you might find that fusion reactors become economical in the outer solar system. And there might be some distance where this amount of solar panels and big, mirrors becomes less price effective per watt generated than this amount of fusion reactor. And that might turn out to be on Earth itself. We might find that fusion reactors are incredibly economical once we start rolling them out. Or it might turn out that they are only good once you get out to, say, Saturn's distance. We'll find out in the long term, and it won't be an instant solve. It will change with time as you have one improvement or another. But it is just the nature of these things is never double down on a single power source, double down on all of them, because you don't know what's going to work yet. If we did, we would be using it. And that can include, again, why do I say fossil fuels? Because that could be a fossil one. It can include hydrocarbons or chemical fuels. Because, again, we can use power from a stationary reactor that's very big to generate them as that compact and, in this case, neutral power supply for something mobile. It's hard to plug a nuclear reactor into a spaceship that's trying to fly off. On the flip side, you might say, well, let's not generate hydrogen and oxygen for this thing to go into space with as a fuel. Let's power Star Tram or a launch loop. And that's going to be very dependent on moving factors and goalposts, again, like everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is all about mission weight. Like I was part of Nuclear and Emerging Technology in Space, and they quite lightly point out that it is solar. Anywhere closer or almost even at Mars for power production, the mission weight is vastly favors solar. But after that orbital distance, it breaks even for nuclear fission, and then you're looking at a 100 megawatt reactor anywhere out there, and you can have a 100 megawatts in the orbit of Mars for about the same mission launch cost. Go ahead, Chris.
But one small improvement to panel width or reactor shielding could suddenly alter that equation a little bit so it was out the out or close to Venus. So.
Right.
Hey, I give a little bit of pushback here, Isaac. You mentioned aluminum foil, which can be very, very thin or can be kind of a moderate thickness. But there's a solar wind issue in space, especially I think inside the asteroid orbits. So wouldn't we need something to hold the aluminum foil in place, but also aluminum foil that's thick enough, which comes back to your weight issue of getting it in orbit in the first place. So isn't that kind of a difficult thing to actually pull off?
Yes and no. You're right. The solar wind is a factor there. So is just light itself. Photonic radiant pressure is how solar sails work. They can use either solar wind for like a magnetic sail or reflecting light for a just classic solar sail to move around. And this actually becomes a very easy way for you to do your maintenance of orbits with these things, is because when they're that thin, you can start reflecting that light off at a little bit of an angle to move yourself in. Or around. And the same way you can also have, say, let's say I take a big circular panel and I spin it a little bit so it stays spread out, and I put a few wires to connect it down to some central winch. And it can pull those things in a little bit to make the panel a little bit smaller, or maybe let it out a little bit wider. And that lets you drop it closer to the sun and move it further away, too. The basic one there is what's called a statite, and that was a portmanteau for a static satellite that Robert Ford came up with. And that's one that's just in the right place to hover. It's just the right thickness, and that's very thin indeed. I want to say it's a few nanometers thickness. And something like that could wear down pretty easy from solar radiation. But it might be a few decades for it damaged enough that it had to be recycled or repaired or even replaced. It's a thin solar, maybe a little shade, so it's probably viable. The big innovation I come up with that was called what I just called a Ligide, because you go a little bit thicker instead. Now it won't float on its own, it's still in orbit, but it can orbit at a different speed than normal, a non-Keplerian orbit. You've also had like a quasite and a few other variations similar to that. That says, well, I can now adjust this thing so we'll fall towards the sun, move away from the sun, bend or move at angles. It could be a lot thicker because it's still in an orbital pattern. And that's the basic approach there, is say, well, we are always going to have wear and tear on these things. My guess is that you probably grab the thing up every decade or so, which it can move itself because it's a big solar sail, and you recycle it and spit it back out. You got a lot of power supply for that recycling process. It does need guidance. It's not going to be just a panel by itself. It's going to make more sense to put little computerization on it and some wires to bend it around, but it becomes its own movable system. If you wanted to, you could even pack a small ion drive onto something like that too, but I think it would probably be unnecessary for a solar shade or solar mirror element, just because they are all very thin, light-focused objects. You could do this with a magnetic sail too, for the more focus on solar wind. It just uses a solar panel to generate a little bit of electric current, and you've got that magnet that's going to be pushed by those particles. These are great approaches for propulsion and for station keeping that we have prototypes for, and we've actually done a decent amount of work on them, but still not in that zone where they're as handy as, time-tested low Earth orbit satellite stuff, which goes into the shadow very regularly. This is one of our big problems with using solar in space, and where we don't see as much of it as we'd expect, is most of our satellites are as close to the ground as we can get them. The only reason they aren't lower is because they'd go in the atmosphere and rapidly deorbit. So we put them as close as we can to the planet, which means they're in the shadow of the planet half the time. And a 45-minute charge I'm going to charge up for 45 minutes and then run for 45 minutes. That's a pretty decent battery load, and it means you need a better solar power, so there are limits on what you can do in low Earth orbit compared to what you can get away with in medium, high orbits or Lagrange points or even just interplanetary space. But I would say that it would not be too much of a hurdle to deal with the solar wind itself or the light pressure. You're still going to have micrometeors and dust coming through too, and they're going to wear on those things a lot. You have some kilometer wide panel that's going to get abraded. a small micrometeor going through it is just going to poke a little hole through. It's not going to trash thing. It's like shooting a bullet through a ship sail. It's just going to go right through and leave a hole. But that's going to wear these things down. And they could also, if you're not doing that right, start making space debris themselves, which is why you probably do not want them in low orbit if you can avoid it. Folks will sometimes say, why off at L1, why not just in low orbit? And well, that could work, but you could get a Kessler syndrome event a little bit easier then too. And Kessler syndrome is a lot more dangerous for big, thin objects like that too. So not as easily said as done, right? But it is, I think, one of those things where it is definitely viable. We just have to actually put the effort into seeing what the real problems will be with prototypes of them.
Great. I want to take our last 5 minutes and maybe we can sort of reflect on this problem that we're facing where our existing economics doesn't conceptualize the opportunity of exponential growth in space quite like it does our existing modes of production. Like in computer technology, I know there's 6 or 8 overlapping opportunities. Using improved process means less silicon, less power use, more communication bandwidth, more storage, higher processing speed. And this makes that technology, even if each part is a logistic curve, it makes it all combined look like exponential growth. And I think maybe with space, we have another opportunity there. We have less energy to transport, less energy and complexity in manufacturing, less energy to extract materials. And these all may combine to just provide amazing exponential growth in the short term. The reason that I sort of go off on this tangent is because our economic systems or our analysts aren't recognizing this as an enormous opportunity, sort of in the same way that we don't recognize the utility of built infrastructure, like a bridge or a nuclear plant that lasts 80 to 100 years doesn't pencil out in our economy where a gas plant pays for itself within a year. And so if we had more long-lived investment strategies, I think we would see more investment in space and, of course, more investment in nuclear. But what's your perspective on space and how a little bit of hard work and investment will get us to just exponential growth into space?
Of course, exponential growth is always one of those. There's almost always going to be something that tends to dampen it a little bit, but it is, the thing about space is there's just so much of it. So you can grow a lot in space. One of the fun things about the NSS is we have an award that we've started giving out in recent years much more easily because there's a lot more projects for it. That's funded by Martine Rothblatt, the founder of SiriusXM. And it goes to whichever company gives us the best business model for something they can actually do in space and will do. And they get the award helping the startup on that. And there are more and more of those kind of projects starting to actually move forward as, well, again, our economy is not really set up with longer term investing always at the forefront of things. There is a much more opportunities for shorter term investment in space arising. And I would say, as just a civilization, we are a lot more open to longer term investment than we used to be. Obviously, folks in the economy are always going to play for what makes the most sense for them personally to do. But at the same time, we do see a lot of very long term projects in our civilization popping back up. And it's nothing new. We've been doing that since pyramids and cathedrals too, or canal building projects. We will put the time in when we have a clear proof that it will do well. That's a lot harder when we're talking about new scientific research, of course, though, because well, if you'll gamble this money for the next 50 years so that we might be able to come up with a possible profitable thing, it might be the most profitable thing ever. I say, well, that's good. I might be alive then too. Not always as attractive as a model. And that is one of the reasons why we often use government-funded research or charitable foundations. So we'd have to come up with some solutions for dealing with that. I have no magic means at hand for making companies, convince themselves they should be investing more in space beyond just trying to share with them the emerging new and better options available. And that is one of the things the National Space Society seeks to do, and what my show tries to do too, for that matter, is to acquaint people with the idea that this is not far out sci-fi technology anymore. It's something that's happening, much like with AI. For years we told people AI is right over the hill, and they said, oh, that's never going to happen, or it was going to pop up overnight, you have Skynet, and they said, no, it's incremental, it's time to see and invest in this an emerging economic area now. Same for space, same for power production. What we want to do is not tell people what the best path forward is, because I don't know what it is. I want to give them more and more options, to acquaint them with, a universe of options, and that's what space offers in the long term. And the short term, we hope to give them a lot more options for helping us get into space.
Wonderful. This has been our special guest, Isaac Arthur of Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. You can check out the Eco-Modernist channel live every Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern on soyaddle.tv or twitch.tv/soyaddle, on YouTube at Eco-Modernist1 or the Eco-Modernist channel live, on Facebook at the Eco-Modernist Society of North America, and of course on our website, esna.earth. Thank you all for your contributions, and don't forget you can contribute directly to us via Patreon at the Eco-Modernist Society on patreon.com. So thanks everyone for your contributions, and don't mind, I'm going to mute us a little slower than usual. To take us out, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
I want to speak to you about a new organization called the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. Eco-modernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Eco-modernism as a philosophy is described in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves. To the contrary, we believe that humanity is at a crossroads that severely